Some vans get retired the moment the odometer hits six figures. These 10 didn't get the memo. Built by Japanese manufacturers who cared more about surviving mud, mountains, and decades of abuse than winning a beauty contest, these 4x4 vans were engineered like tanks. Overbuilt, underestimated, and nearly impossible to kill. Some are still hauling passengers across broken roads today, decades after they should have been scrapped. We're counting down 10 of the toughest. Stick around for number 1, because the story behind it is the whole reason this list exists. Number 10. Mitsubishi Delica Wagon. Before crossovers pretended to be capable, Mitsubishi built a van that actually was one. The Delica Wagon's four-wheel drive system wasn't a marketing afterthought, bolted on for a brochure photo. It was engineered onto a chassis borrowed and modified from Mitsubishi's Pajero program. The mid-1980s were not kind to vans. Most manufacturers treated the segment as a box on wheels, built to move cargo between two paved points and nothing more. Mitsubishi looked at rural Japan's unpaved mountain roads and decided a van needed the same drivetrain confidence as a proper off-roader. The Star Wagon shipped with a straightforward part-time four-wheel drive system, two-wheel drive for the highway, high-range and low-range four-wheel drive selectable for everything else. Simple enough that owners could understand exactly what was happening under the floor. Here's the quiet part. Nobody advertises. This van outlasted entire truck lineups that were supposed to replace it. Contemporary pickups from the same manufacturer have long since been redesigned into unrecognizable shapes, chasing crash test ratings and infotainment screens. The Star Wagon's boxy proportions and simple mechanicals meant less to break and less reason to retire one early. Owners in New Zealand, Australia, and the UK's grey import scene still run these as daily drivers and weekend campers 4 decades on. Parts interchange with other period Mitsubishi products keeps the survivors alive well past when the factory stopped thinking about them. What makes the Star Wagon's survival rate genuinely notable is how little sympathy these vans received over the decades. They weren't garaged collector pieces. They hauled families, camping gear, and cargo through daily use in climates that punish undercoating and electronics alike. A van that shrugs off that kind of treatment for 40 years isn't surviving by luck. It's surviving because the original engineering left very little to fail in the first place. Compare that to the disposable by design mentality that crept into vehicle manufacturing through the following decades, where plastic components and complex electronics turned routine maintenance into an exercise in frustration. The Star Wagon predates most of that shift, and its mechanical straightforwardness is precisely why independent mechanics anywhere in the world can still keep one on the road without needing a manufacturer's diagnostic computer. That's the real legacy here, a van built during an era when Japanese manufacturers were still proving themselves on durability rather than luxury, and the proof is still driving around 4 decades later. Every countdown needs an opening entry that sets the bar, and the Star Wagon does exactly that before this list even gets to the vans built on its shoulders. Anyone still daily driving an L300 Star Wagon? Drop the mileage on your odometer below. Number 9. Nissan Caravan. Nissan built the Caravan to survive Japan's most unglamorous job, moving people and freight for companies that couldn't afford downtime. That single design brief, corporate fleet duty, not weekend adventure, is exactly why so many are still working today. Through the E24 and E25 generations, Nissan offered the Caravan with genuinely serious diesel engines, built for high-mileage commercial service, not the softer gasoline units aimed at private buyers. Fleet operators bought these because the total cost of ownership over a decade beat anything else on the lot. 4-wheel drive versions included for routes that turned to gravel or snow outside the cities. The quiet humiliation here is aimed at anyone who thinks reliability requires a badge with a premium price tag. The Caravan wasn't styled to impress anyone in a parking lot. It was engineered to still be running when the company that bought it had gone through 3 fleet managers and 2 economic downturns. Decades of unglamorous commercial service is precisely the kind of resume that makes a vehicle nearly impossible to kill. Nobody babied these vans, and they kept running anyway. Fleet maintenance culture in Japan also plays a role most enthusiasts overlook. Commercial operators running caravans on tight schedules couldn't afford unplanned downtime, so these vans were serviced on strict intervals by drivers and mechanics, who treated maintenance as non-negotiable rather than optional. That culture of disciplined upkeep, multiplied across a vehicle already engineered for longevity, is a huge part of why so many E24 and E25 examples are still capable of full workdays decades after they left the factory. The 4-wheel drive variants specifically found favor with utility companies and rural delivery services who needed a vehicle that wouldn't get stranded. The first time a job took them off paved roads. Unlike passenger-oriented vans chasing a smoother ride, the Caravan's 4-wheel drive system was built around the assumption that reliability under load, not comfort, was the actual selling point. It's a van that never tried to be interesting, and that's exactly why it's still working. Strip away every other consideration, and what's left is a simple equation. A manufacturer that built for total cost of ownership over a decade, sold to buyers who couldn't afford to be wrong about that math, and a drivetrain that held up its end of the bargain, generation after generation. Nobody buys a Caravan to be seen in it. They buy it to still be running it a decade later. Company fleet vehicles usually get destroyed. The Caravan is the exception. Why do you think that is? Number 8. Toyota LiteAce. The LiteAce is easy to underestimate, and that's exactly the point. Toyota built it compact and lightweight at a time when its bigger sibling, the HiAce, was already earning a reputation for indestructibility. The LiteAce had to prove itself in the shadow of a legend, using less metal and a smaller footprint to do it. 4-wheel drive arrived with the 3rd generation M30 LiteAce in 1985, aimed squarely at buyers who needed to reach places a 2-wheel drive van simply couldn't. True to the platform's cab-over roots, the engine sat in the midsection beneath the cabin floor, giving the van a lower, more centered weight distribution than its boxy shape suggested it should have. Here's the quiet part. A van built to be the affordable, lightweight option ended up matching the off-road capability of vehicles that cost considerably more. Toyota didn't market the LiteAce as an adventure vehicle. It didn't need to. Owners figured out on their own that a light van with proper 4-wheel drive could go further than its reputation suggested. Decades later, surviving examples are prized in the JDM import scene precisely because they combine Toyota's legendary mechanical simplicity with a size that fits places a full-size van never could. The mid-engine layout deserves more credit than it usually gets. Placing the engine beneath and behind the front seats rather than out ahead of the front axle shortened the LiteAce's overall footprint without sacrificing interior space, letting it thread through narrow mountain tracks and tight urban alleys with equal ease. That same packaging also kept weight more centered over the chassis, which paid off directly when the surface underneath turned to gravel or mud. Toyota's reputation for over-engineering reliability into everything it built carried straight through to this smaller sibling. The LiteAce never got its own marketing campaign built around toughness the way the HiAce did, but the parts bin, the build quality, and the fundamental mechanical philosophy were cut from the same cloth. Buyers who wanted HiAce-grade dependability in a smaller, cheaper package found exactly that, whether or not Toyota ever bothered to advertise it that way. That combination of quiet capability and a shrinking supply of clean survivors is exactly why prices on good examples have been climbing steadily in the import scene. A van built to live in a legend's shadow ended up earning a legacy of its own, one clean survivor, and one word-of-mouth recommendation at a time. Would you trust a mid-engine van over a front-engine one for off-road work? Make the case below. Number 7. Mazda Bongo. Mazda's Bongo rarely gets mentioned in the same breath as the HiAce or Delica, and that omission says more about marketing budgets than actual capability. This is a van that quietly did the same job in rural Japan for decades, without ever chasing the spotlight. The Bongo Brawny generation offered diesel power specifically because Mazda understood its buyers: farmers, small tradespeople, and rural delivery operators who needed torque over top speed and fuel economy over horsepower bragging rights. Four-wheel drive wasn't a premium trim gimmick here. It was table stakes for a customer base that lived where pavement sometimes just stopped. The quiet humiliation is this: while flashier vans got the magazine covers, the Bongo just kept showing up to work. It didn't need a cult following to prove its worth, because the people who actually depended on it every day already knew. Rural Japan still runs these well past the point most vehicles get retired, and that unglamorous, unbroken service record is the entire reason it belongs on a list about vans that refuse to die. Part of the Bongo's staying power comes from Mazda's willingness to keep the platform mechanically conservative, long after competitors chase new technology for its own sake. Simpler fuel systems, fewer sensors, and a diesel engine architecture built around durability rather than peak output meant fewer things to diagnose when something eventually did go wrong, and fewer things going wrong in the first place. The four-wheel drive system followed that same philosophy: functional over flashy, engaged when needed, and otherwise staying out of the way. For the tradespeople and farmers who made up the bulk of Bongo buyers, that kind of unglamorous consistency mattered infinitely more than a badge that photographed well. It's telling that a van built with zero interest in impressing anyone outside its actual customer base has quietly outlasted plenty of vehicles that were built specifically to impress. There's also something to be said for what obscurity protects. Vans that never became famous never became targets for the kind of aggressive, corner-cutting resale flipping that tends to accelerate the decline of more desirable models. Bongos changed hands quietly, between owners who actually needed a working van, rather than getting run hard by short-term buyers chasing a trend. Number 6. Isuzu Fargo. The Isuzu Fargo carries a name most Western audiences have never heard, and that obscurity hides an interesting truth. This van didn't start life as a clean-sheet Isuzu design. It was born from a partnership arrangement with Nissan, sharing core engineering with the Caravan and Homie platform, while wearing Isuzu badges and grille styling. That arrangement made sense for the era. Isuzu wanted a commercial van in its lineup, without the enormous cost of engineering one from scratch, and Nissan had a proven platform already earning its keep in fleet service. The result was a rugged commercial design, built for exactly the kind of long-service life duty Isuzu's diesel engine reputation was built on. Here's the quiet part worth sitting with. A van built through a badge-sharing shortcut ended up just as durable as the original it was based on, because the underlying engineering was sound, regardless of which logo sat on the hood. Buyers who wanted an Isuzu diesel with van practicality got exactly what the badge implied, even if the DNA underneath told a more complicated story. Surviving Fargos are rarer than their Nissan siblings today, mostly because fewer were built, but the ones still running prove the shared platform's reputation for longevity holds regardless of nameplate. Badge engineering partnerships like this one get an unfair reputation in enthusiast circles, usually dismissed as a cynical cost-cutting exercise with no real engineering merit behind it. The Fargo pushes back on that assumption directly. Isuzu didn't just slap a new grille on a Nissan van and call it done. The diesel engine options and drivetrain tuning reflected Isuzu's own commercial vehicle expertise layered onto a proven chassis, giving buyers a genuinely different ownership experience, even with shared underpinnings. That combination of Nissan's structural durability and Isuzu's diesel know-how is exactly the kind of pairing that should have produced a mediocre compromise. Instead, it produced a van that diesel-focused commercial buyers specifically sought out over the Caravan itself, precisely because Isuzu's tuning philosophy leaned even harder into longevity over refinement. Number 5. Subaru Sumo, also known as the Domingo or Libero. Depending on where you bought one, this van answered to 3 different names: Sumo, Domingo, or Libero, and most people who've heard of any one of them have no idea the other 2 exist. Subaru's export naming strategy buried this van's identity across markets so thoroughly that even enthusiasts sometimes miss that it's the same vehicle. Launched in 1983, it borrowed its 3-cylinder engine architecture from the Subaru Justi and mounted it in the rear, unusual packaging that gave the van genuinely useful weight distribution. 4-wheel drive was offered from the start as a selectable option, engaged through a simple gear stick mounted button rather than anything electronically complicated, the kind of mechanical simplicity that ages well. The quiet humiliation, a van most people can't even name, correctly outlasted plenty of vehicles that were household names in their day. Subaru didn't build this one to be famous. It built it to work, using engineering borrowed from an economy car, and somehow making it more durable than vans that cost considerably more. Surviving examples confuse import inspectors and enthusiasts alike over what to even call them, which is, in its own way, proof of how thoroughly this van has outlived its own marketing. The rear-mounted engine layout wasn't just a packaging quirk borrowed for convenience. It gave the van a genuinely different weight distribution than nearly every front-engine competitor on this list, putting mass directly over the rear axle for improved traction on loose surfaces. The same fundamental physics that made rear-engine sports cars famous applied instead to a cargo van built for farmers and small businesses. Subaru's decision to base the drivetrain on Justi-derived components also meant this van inherited a genuinely proven engine architecture rather than something rushed to market. Owners today report exactly what you would expect from that pedigree: an engine that's mechanically simple enough to service with basic tools, married to a selectable 4-wheel drive system that doesn't require an engineering degree to operate. 3 names, 1 chassis, and a survival rate that's largely gone unnoticed outside the markets that actually got to buy it. If a single van could be nominated as the most underrated entry on this entire list, purely on the gap between how few people know it exists and how well it's actually held up, this would be the one. Obscurity, in this case, was never a mark against it. It was simply the cost of never chasing attention in the first place. Sumo, Domingo, or Libero. Did you already know these 3 names were the same van? Number 4. Subaru Sambar. The Sambar's rear engine layout looks like an engineering compromise at first glance. It's actually the reason this van refuses to die. Placing the engine over the driven wheels gave it traction advantages that front-engine competitors simply couldn't match on loose or steep terrain, and Subaru leaned into that from early on. 4-wheel drive arrived as an option in 1979, and it found its real audience almost immediately: farmers working rough, unpaved terrain who needed a vehicle that treated steep grades and mud as a Tuesday rather than an obstacle. The demand was strong enough that Subaru released a dedicated farming Sambar variant in 1981, built specifically around that use case. Here's the quiet part. A key class van, restricted by regulation to a tiny engine and a compact footprint, ended up earning a cult following that vans twice its size never achieved. Size limitations forced Subaru's engineers to be clever, rather than brute force their way to capability, and that cleverness is exactly what farmers came to depend on. Subaru kept building the Sambar in-house for over 5 decades, before finally handing the nameplate to rebadged donor platforms. A production run long enough that farming Sambar units from the early 1980s are still working the same rural roads they were built for. That decades-long in-house production run matters more than it sounds. Every generation Subaru engineered itself, rather than outsourcing to a badge-sharing partner, meant the rear engine layout and drivetrain philosophy stayed consistent across generations, instead of getting diluted by a donor platform's compromises. Number 3. Mitsubishi Delica Space Gear. By the time the Space Gear generation arrived, Mitsubishi had stopped treating four-wheel drive as an option box to tick, and started treating it as the entire point. This generation introduced independent front suspension to the Delica lineup, a genuine engineering upgrade that improved both on-road manners and off-road articulation simultaneously, rather than trading one for the other. Super Select four-wheel drive carried over and matured here, giving drivers a genuine range of drive modes, from fuel-efficient two-wheel drive to locked, low-range four-wheel drive for serious terrain. This wasn't badge engineering borrowed from a passenger car system. It was purpose-built for a van that needed to carry a family in comfort on Monday and cross at Mountain Pass on Saturday. The quiet humiliation lands squarely on modern crossover SUVs that market themselves as capable using a fraction of the drivetrain sophistication this 1990s van shipped with as standard equipment. Independent front suspension paired with a genuine transfer case is a combination plenty of current-day vehicles still don't bother offering. Space Gear survivors remain some of the most sought-after vans in the overland and expedition vehicle community specifically, because this combination of comfort and genuine off-road hardware has rarely been matched since. The naming itself reflects Mitsubishi's ambition for this generation. Space Gear wasn't just a marketing flourish. It signaled a van designed to carry both people and equipment in genuine comfort, rather than treating passenger space and cargo capability as competing priorities that had to be traded off against each other. Interior packaging grew accordingly, without sacrificing the mechanical seriousness underneath. Super Select's real advantage over a simpler part-time four-wheel drive system is flexibility drivers actually use day to day. Being able to run in full-time four-wheel drive on the highway for stability, then lock into low range for a genuinely difficult trail, all without leaving the driver's seat, meant owners never had to choose between everyday comfort and weekend capability. That's the kind of engineering thoughtfulness that's expensive to replicate, and even more expensive for competitors to justify on a van instead of a dedicated SUV. Decades later, the Space Gear's reputation among overlanders isn't nostalgia. It's a direct result of hardware that still outperforms plenty of purpose-built off-road vehicles sold today. Few vans on this list balance genuine capability and genuine comfort as evenly as this one manages to. Independent front suspension and Super Select four-wheel drive in a 90s van. Which modern SUV actually beats this spec sheet? Number 2. Toyota HiAce. There's a reason the joke about cockroaches and HiAce vans surviving the apocalypse together keeps circulating, and it's not really a joke. Fleet data out of East Africa and the Australian outback backs up the reputation with actual numbers, not just internet folklore. These are vans that keep running in conditions that would strand most vehicles within a week. The H200 generation carried that reputation into the modern era without diluting it. Toyota kept the mechanical simplicity that made earlier HiAce generations bulletproof, while updating the platform enough to remain in active production across multiple global markets today. That's not a nostalgia act. It's a van still being built because the formula still works. The quiet humiliation is aimed squarely at every manufacturer that's tried to build a HiAce killer over the decades and quietly discontinued it a few years later. Millions of units produced and running across Asia, Africa, and Australia isn't a coincidence. It's what happens when a manufacturer refuses to overcomplicate a vehicle that customers depend on to simply not break down. Overlanders, safari operators, and commercial fleets across 3 continents didn't choose the HiAce because of clever marketing. They chose it because when everything else failed on a remote route, the HiAce kept moving. What separates the HiAce from most vehicles that earn a durability reputation is that the reputation was built entirely by owners, not by Toyota's marketing department. There was no advertising campaign engineered around toughness, no stunt video of the van surviving something absurd for a press release. The reputation grew organically, route by route, breakdown that never happened by breakdown that never happened, until it became common knowledge across entire continents without a single dollar spent promoting it. Toyota's global parts and service network deserves real credit here too. Even in remote regions, HiAce parts and mechanics familiar with the platform are far easier to find than for almost any competitor, which means a van that does eventually need a repair gets back on the road faster than something more exotic. Durability without serviceability is only half the equation, and the HiAce has quietly nailed both for generations. A van earning its reputation purely through decades of unglamorous, undocumented reliability is exactly the kind of legacy that can't be bought. Only built, one surviving example at a time. No amount of advertising budget produces that kind of trust. Only decades of simply not letting people down does. East Africa runs on HiAce vans. If you've seen one running way past where it should have died, tell us where. Number 1. Mitsubishi Delica D5. The van that tops this list isn't a relic being kept alive by dedicated hobbyists. It's still in production, still evolving, and still carrying the Delica name that's led this bloodline since the Star Wagon opened this very countdown. That continuity across 4 decades of Japanese van engineering is the buried fact most people miss entirely. Mitsubishi built the D5 around SAWC, a full-time all-wheel drive system that electronically manages torque distribution, rather than relying on a driver-selected low-range transfer case, the way earlier Delicas did. It's a genuinely different philosophy from its ancestors. Less mechanical, more computer-managed, but the result is a van that still delivers real trail capability while adding modern safety and comfort earlier generations never had. The quiet humiliation here isn't aimed at a competitor. It's aimed at every other manufacturer that abandoned the capable family van concept entirely, leaving buyers to choose between a soft crossover or a stripped-out commercial cargo van with nothing in between. Mitsubishi just kept building the thing everyone else gave up on. 4 decades after the Star Wagon proved a family van could handle real terrain, the D5 is still proving it. Which is exactly why the same lineage that opened this countdown at number 10 takes the top spot at number 1. Being current production is what actually separates this entry from everything else on this list. Every other van here survives because it was overbuilt decades ago and simply refuses to quit. The D5 has to earn its place a different way, by staying relevant in a market that's largely abandoned this entire vehicle category in favor of crossovers with none of the genuine capability. That Mitsubishi still bothers is itself a statement about how much demand for a real capable family van never actually went away. SAWC's electronic torque management trades some of the mechanical simplicity that made the earlier Delicas so easy to service in a home garage, and that's a fair trade-off to be honest about, rather than gloss over. What owners get in return is a system that reacts to changing traction conditions faster than a human driver ever could, distributing power exactly where it's needed before wheel spin even becomes noticeable. A genuinely different kind of capability than a manually engaged low-range transfer case. Not a worse one, just a different philosophy for a different era. The Delica name has now covered 4 decades, 5 distinct engineering philosophies, and 0 interruptions in proving that a van can be a genuine off-road vehicle. That's not a survival story, that's a dynasty. The D5 is still in production today. Would you pick it over a brand new SUV? Genuinely? 10 vans, 4 decades, and a running theme that ties every single one of them together. Japanese manufacturers built for total cost of ownership and mechanical simplicity long before either phrase became a marketing buzzword, and the survivors on the road today are the receipts. If one of these vans is still running in your driveway, your neighborhood, or your country's grey import scene, drop it in the comments below. We read every one, and the best stories end up in future videos.